Welcome back. We got the Fate channel, we got all the news, anniversary stuff, yada yada yada, go big one. And we got an announcement for another Hero Rises, as we usually get every year. It's the same song and dance for the most part. You vote for characters you want to see, top 8 voting gauntlet, top 4 get on the banner, first place is free. And because of that, I wanted to talk about just notable candidates for a Hero Rises, especially if you are on the fence on who you want to vote for. I compiled a list of decent units, in my opinion, for each respective color, if you don't necessarily have any sort of direction in what you really want out of it. So yeah, that's pretty much all there is to it. Before anything, I do want to briefly mention that there are not going to be any normal pool units on any of these lists, and that's because you could just get them at any time. And while a lot of them may not necessarily be through just random banners that may or may not show up, I find that because they're already in the normal pool, they're not necessarily as worth going out for, especially for a limited time event where you could get one unit of any kind. And that even includes Brave units in my opinion, so stuff like Brave Self, who's really meta potent right now. He's more than likely going to get 4 to 5 more banners before the next CYL anyway, so if you did want him, I don't necessarily think this is the best time to go for it. So that's my general mindset when it comes to all this. It's really just going to be units that are either limited or units that are just really difficult to get in general. Other than that, there's going to be some weird placements for some of these, which may stand out. But yeah, I figured I'd let you know as we go into the first list on the red units, where I have 3 categories: high priority, worth considering, and low priority. You may find that some of these units are in weird positions where you would necessarily think that maybe they should be higher, but this isn't necessarily a tier list on whether the unit is good or bad, but rather just taking a lot of stuff into consideration as to why you would want to vote for some over others. So for example, Summer Edelgard isn't going to be reran for a long time. She was already on a double special hero banner, and she's extremely strong as a Gale Force unit and general far or near save depending on what you want to use. The same with Duma. He's one of the best far save units that we currently have in the game, and while there is plenty of steep competition, his role as a general far save is one of the strongest because he can prevent instant specials, which makes him really coveted overall as a tank. And that's part of the reason why I have them up here specifically, especially since they're not going to be reran for a long time. Meanwhile, with Valentine's Crumb and the Desert Lind, I find that while they're both extremely strong units, Duo Crumb is going to be reran on his initial banner quite soon because we are in the month of February, and Lind is still currently on a banner. And I don't want that to necessarily take away from their overall usefulness because they're both fantastic units that are going to have a lot of staying power for a long time. However, I find that because the latter's still on a banner and the former's going to be on a banner relatively soon outside of a Hero Rises, that you may not necessarily want to vote for them in my opinion, and that if you were looking to get them in your barracks anytime soon, you could currently do that with the latter one. And then again, the former one's going to be back really soon anyway. Other than that, I also have Legendary Nana and Legendary Veronica in high priority. And the reason I have them specifically at the top is because of the new arena change, where depending on the season and lineup of bonuses, you can basically cheese arena scoring to an absurd degree, where you do any sort of difficulty, you get the max score, and you can lose units. So it's basically just really easy at that point. And because of that, I find that legendary units overall have just risen in value in general, but also these two in particular are some of the strongest legendaries that we currently have in the game in my opinion. Legendary Nana ignores stuff like damage reduction, godlike reflexes, hardy fighter, so on and so forth. She has half no follow-up with true damage, desperation, and Kanto remaining +1, so she can act as a really strong initiator and run away after combat. Meanwhile, with Veronica, while she is currently on a banner, I would argue that she's one of the most valuable units that we have in the game in terms of combat prowess because of enclosure, her overall damage output, and the fact that she has a fire sweep desperation effect, meaning that she's going to consistently kill most if not everything. Which is why I do think if you do plan to vote for any unit from the red pool, these 4 in particular are going to be some of the best. Although you could also consider stuff like Ninja Camilla, Emblem, Rearmed Lif, and Rearmed Ophelia. Ninja Camilla is arguably one of our strongest Vantage units in the game, in part due to the fact that she has a free B slot, and she's a flyer, meaning that she can actually take hits if she needs to due to her relatively decent mixed bulk. She hits really hard because of the free B slot that otherwise would have been for Vantage. She has dual phase Brave with Slaying and just hits generally hard overall. And most of the time, she's going to be making her res check because most units do not have as much res as she does. You also have Emblem, who just makes Dark Season absurdly easy because of her innate Severance, which inflicts feud on foes at the start of the turn, and it disables saves in general, meaning that you're not going to be able to get any sort of support whatsoever. And her innate guard makes it so that Gale Force strategies are also going to be a bit more tough, especially if you can't Gale Force off her due to the fact that she does have guard innately. She is arguably one of our best, if not the best, defense mythics we've ever had. And if you don't have her now, she will be rerunning relatively soon. I think it's either in a month or in 2 months. But for what it's worth, I do think if you do play Aether Raids, she's one of the most valuable mythics you could ever get. And then as for Rearmed Lif and Ophelia, the reason I have them in worth considering is because they're currently being treated like they treated Dual Ephraim way back when, where they're just not in the normal pool, and outside of the obligatory banners they may show up on, there's no guarantee you're ever going to see them again. And while that may sound like fear of missing out syndrome, which it somewhat is to be fair, and Lif is currently on the legendary banner, I find that due to how limited in scope they are, it's definitely going to be a bit more worthwhile, especially since you don't even lose the unit if you do inherit their weapon or any sort of skill, which is why I do think they're extremely valuable in general. And that's really about it when it comes to the reds. Following the reds, we also have a good amount of blues, and they also follow a similar status to the reds, where you have legendaries that are very, very worthwhile because of the new arena change, some units that are just absurdly valuable because of what they bring to the table, and then just general decent to really strong units that are either really limited or legendaries or so on and so forth. So for high priority, I have Legendary Myrrh, Legendary Female Shez, and Summer Thor. Legendary Myrrh, while I would have necessarily put him worth considering, is one of the highest scoring units that we have in the game, thanks to the fact that she does have access to the Distant Counter Seal, which does boost her overall bin to much higher than a lot of the other legendaries. Which is why I do think comparatively, if you did have to use her as a bonus, and she is applicable for the arena bonus, that she's going to be one of the most valuable units that you could ever have. Meanwhile, with Legendary Shez, she does follow a similar suit to Myrrh, although she doesn't score as high. Regardless, her combat prowess is still one of the strongest that we have because of the basically everything effectiveness that she has: dual phase Brave, Breath, penalty neutralization, and access to lethality, on top of being infantry. She's arguably one of the strongest player phase units that we have in the game, and it's really, really apparent. Other than that, there's Summer Thor, and you could always wait for her to rerun on the Summer banner, even though that's going to be a while from this point. But in terms of just overall usefulness, Summer Thor is probably our best hybrid unit that we have in the game. Not only because she can instant charge stuff like AoEs and loop it pretty consistently, but she also has World Breaker, she inflicts exposure and stall, and if you were to make her just pure support, or if you wanted to just go all hybrid entirely, you could give her Sudden Panic and stack up her HP, and she just has a lot of flexibility in general. And if you did have to vote for any of the blues, I would highly recommend these three. So you could always consider stuff like Alfred, Ashe, Sheeta, Cordelia, and Deirdre. Alfred, again, follows a similar suit to the other rearms. There's no telling when they're going to rerun outside of the obligatory legendary and remix banners. After that, he may just never show up for a long time. It would help if they communicated this, but they don't, so we really have speculation to work off of. And while Alfred is still currently on a banner, I find that you can't necessarily go wrong with just getting more rearms in general because you don't lose the unit. And I would argue that something like an Arcane is going to provide more value than just maybe a one-off finish or anything of the sort, since you're essentially boosting up one unit and you're keeping the other as a result. You also have New Year Ashe, who I think flew under the radar in terms of usefulness. She is a really solid frontliner and can provide external support for just teleporting in part due to the fact that she has opening retainer, but she's also really, really strong in the enemy phase because she has enemy phase Brave, really, really good bulk, slaying, opening retainer. I would say that her hybrid nature isn't necessarily as strong as Thor's, but what Ashe can provide on her own is what makes her pretty valuable and worth considering in my opinion. Meanwhile, with Legendary Sheeta, she also follows a similar suit to all the other legendaries. She isn't exactly a strong legendary, and if you did want to kill her off, I don't think it'd necessarily be the worst. But I do think comparatively, she is a bit easier to use and score way higher out of the gate because she does have a 300 SPB slot, which is much harder to come by comparatively to the A and S. And if you did really want something for just general arena, it's not like she's completely bad. I would say that for what it's worth, the ability to score really, really well right out of the gate, on top of the fact that she is a legendary, does so make her worth considering, even if she isn't necessarily the strongest one. But then you also have stuff like Winter Cordelia and Legendary Deirdre. Winter Cordelia is pretty much just your side grade Bridal Catria if you did want an extra one. It could always be beneficial in stuff like Summoner Duels S, where you have to deploy 4 teams and they basically have to play around. It just adds a lot more pressure in general to the enemy team. Meanwhile, with Legendary Deirdre, she also follows a similar suit to all the other legendaries. Same thing, just a bit stronger here and there, and that's really about it. And then for low priority, I have Halloween Female Corrin and Flame Lynn. The only reason they're low priority is because they're still on an active banner. And there's really no reason why you'd ever really want to vote for them here. But considering that the banner won't show up for a while after the voting has proceeded, it could be worth considering. But I find that if you are already looking into getting something like Godlike Reflexes or Attack Speed Finish 4, then chances are you already grabbed it because you could grab one of them for free anyway. But if you wanted both and you didn't want to summon on the other banner, it's not necessarily the worst. Following blue, we have greens, and in my opinion, the greens aren't necessarily as coveted as a lot of the other colors we got last year. We do have a fair amount of stuff, but for the most part, they either follow a similar suit to everything else that came prior, or they don't necessarily stand out comparatively. Winter Black Knight is a fantastic unit, but he does require a lot of reworking in his kit, because in terms of just Savior stuff, he's not really good with far save due to how his weapon works, and in my opinion, you're better off just making him as a near save unit, but that requires pretty much a complete kit overhaul, which is a bit of an issue. Meanwhile, with Summer Dimitri, he's a really good unit. He has a lot of flexibility in the player phase. You could potentially make him an enemy phase unit if you really wanted to try something with Vantage because of dual phase Brave. And overall, he's just a really strong nuke. But in my opinion, he's not necessarily something you must have. There are so many units in the game that just hit hard for the sake of hitting hard. And while Dimitri can do stuff like Gale Force and all that stuff, and he does have Atrocity, I don't necessarily think it puts him above the rest. Meanwhile, with Ganglot, she's a rearmed, simple as that. You get Arcane Downfall, Quick Riposte 4. Yeah, you get the gist. And then you have Legendary Ninian and Legendary Xander. Legendary Ninian I would have put in high priority. However, she is rerunning soon on a Legendary and Mythic banner, which is the only reason why I have her and worth considering. Otherwise, she would be in the same tier as Legendary Mur because she does follow the same stuff, but she is a lot more hybrid in nature. And overall, Legendary Ninian is a really fantastic unit. I think she's still a really good must-have, especially nowadays for the arena change. But I also don't think you necessarily have to vote for her because she's going to be rerunning soon anyway. And Legendary Xander, pretty much the same thing. He's a legendary, he scores well, arena change, good stuff. You also have a bunch of stuff in low priority, and a lot of it either boils down to they're already readily available, they're still on a current banner, or they're free. And that's pretty much just Summer, Erica, Sather, Sonya, and Ursula. Ursula and Erica are currently on banners as it is. Sonya is going to be rerunning within a month anyway, so you don't necessarily have to get her immediately or vote for her. She is a really strong unit, but I also don't think it's one of those things you have to prioritize because of the fact that she is going to be rerunning around the time the banner does debut. And then Sather, while I do think she is worthwhile in getting some sort of marges, I don't think it's necessarily a priority, especially if you aren't really considering stuff like Aether Raids, because the only benefit you would want to have with her is just marges, and if you don't really need that, then there's really no reason to go for her. But then you have Ninja Cherish, and she's a great unit. She has Dual Phase Brave, true damage reduction, and a lot of nice stuff in general. And in my opinion, she is a really good unit, but I also don't think she's necessarily something that needs voting or priority, especially since there's a lot of other competitive units that you could vote for. And that's nothing against Cherish whatsoever. I just find that there's just not a lot of stuff worth considering in the green pool. And then finally, we have the colorless selection, which is a lot more competitive. You have a lot of good units in general, and a lot of them released recently. You have New Year Asker, who's a fantastic hybrid unit thanks to Open Domain, his Duo skill, which provides a really good amount of stuff to himself and allies, and he has a lot of general flexibility in terms of support and combat. Meanwhile, with Formotus, I find that while he is currently on a banner, which normally would have lowered him down, I think he's probably one of the best units you could ever grab for savior purposes, because Nightmare is probably one of the most disgusting skills we've ever gotten. The ability to shut off any sort of opponent's turn is really unfair, to be honest. Especially in modes like Summoner Duels, where if somebody initiates on him, then a lot of the opposing allies could just get shut off, which means you basically won at that point. It's really, really unfair in that regard. In terms of anima stuff, I don't necessarily think he's the craziest. He can shut off stuff like Gale Force much more consistently, but since Elamine is very present in Astra season, there's a lot more enemy phase strategies in that season comparatively to Light, which is why I do think when it comes to acting as an anima defense mythic, it's easy enough just to bait him out. But regardless, I do think he's still a really valuable unit, and he is 100% worth considering. You also have Duo Nina and Rearmed Grima. Nina, well, not necessarily the craziest in terms of combat, although you could bolster it up with no follow-up support and so on and so forth. She has Canto Recall, and that's really great for hit and run purposes, and that's really the only reason why you'd ever want her. She can initiate combat, hit really hard, get out of the way, and she's safe. And then with Rearmed Grima, she's not only one of the better units we have in terms of savior purposes, but Arcane Grima alongside Hardy Fighter and Near Save is really good in terms of just overall combination. A lot of the other rearms are still relatively decent in their own right. However, I do think Grima in particular is the one that stands out the most because of Dragonhide just being absurdly good, just having general flexibility with enemy phase strategies, no armor weaknesses, really, really high stats, and you don't lose her, and that's really the biggest benefit to it. You don't lose her, you can fodder her off, and you can still keep her. And while you can do the same with all the other arcanes, I find that Grima is still one of the stronger units that we have in the game, which is why I do have her up in high priority. Still, if none of those float your boat, you could always consider stuff like Arvel, Asker, Elamine, Godo, Medius, and Flame Moosebell. Arvel is currently on the banner, but there's still also a really strong Anima Mythic because of the guard effect, really high res, which basically makes them immune to Elamine, and just really good damage output and survivability because of the weapon triangle advantage against pretty much everything. Asker is one of the better light mythics that we have because he has true damage reduction, has tempo, is a really, really good super tank, has open domain, which is really nice for just support in general, and has a lot of flexibility. Elamine I would have in high priority, but she is going to rerun pretty soon, which is why I don't have her up there, but she's still extremely dumb, and I would still recommend going for her if you don't have her. Godo is also a really strong unit, however, I find that you don't necessarily need to get him comparatively to Formotus. Formotus, I find, is just going to provide a lot more in general, even if they both are on the same banner. But also, Godo is going to be rerunning very, very soon comparatively with Medius and Asker, actually. So you don't even necessarily have to roll for any of those three, because they're going to be sharing on a banner quite soon. And then with Flame Moosebow, he's a pretty good damage dealer. He can hit and run Kanto stuff really well. And he has Domain of Flame, which can be used for a bit of hybrid supportive nature. And for that reason, I do have him in worth considering. Other than that, there's Summer Micaiah and Summer Nipple. Both of them are also good in their own ways. Micaiah does have her Brave effect if she has a bunch of res over the foe. It is a bit more finicky against stuff like armors because generally they're going to be stacking up their mixed bulk, but overall she hits really, really hard, especially with her Thani effect. And Nipple does follow a similar suit to Flame Moosebow. However, I find that Moosebow is just a lot better in terms of damage output, and with Nipple, her utility isn't necessarily as coveted in my opinion, because Moosebow's C-Slot isn't as replicable as Nipple's C-Slot, but for what it's worth, she's still a really decent hybrid unit. And if you did want her, there's no reason why you couldn't vote for her. And overall, when it comes to pretty much every color on this batch, I do think there's a lot of stuff worth considering, and if you were struggling to vote on specific units, then I would highly recommend at least taking any of this into account. Whether or not you necessarily agree with some of the points, I do think that for what it's worth, a majority of these units on the list are 100% worth looking into because they can provide a lot more than a lot of the other units that may otherwise clog up all the other colors. But yeah, you'll have to let me know what you think down below. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.